I do remark, though, on the border that Gaza has with Egypt and how very different Israel's war in Gaza against Hamas would have been if Egypt would have complied with its obligations under international law and permitted the safe passage of those civilians fleeing civil disorder in Gaza. How different would it have been if there was a Palestinian humanitarian zone set up the other side of the border in Egyptian Rafah, where there is more space than anyone knows what to do with, where they could have been provided with humanitarian assistance without diversion to Hamas, where Hamas would not have been able to abuse humanitarian zones like it has done with al-Mawasi to fire missiles onto Israeli civilians. That simply wasn't done. And instead, uniquely, these Palestinian civilians, with the blessing of the international community, were forcibly kept in a war zone, not permitted to flee, again, providing succor to Hamas, providing support through maintaining its civilians as human shields, nay, frankly, human sacrifices. That is the policy that Hamas is seeking to pursue. And that is utterly remarkable. It is really something that I feel puts the lie to any person that claims to care about Palestinian civilians and has not called on Egypt to open its border, as I have been doing from October 2023. I can't marry that in my head, Brandon. And that is, frankly, when you ask about how Israel is conducting the war, that is a major, major challenge that Israel has had to navigate. Absent those civilians, had they been evacuated for the period of this armed conflict, of course, progress against Hamas would have looked completely different.
You know, the lack of criticism of Egypt and its failure to open its border has been one of the most striking things of the past 2 years. I mean, if you listen to the left in the West or the media in the West, the international organizations that you talked about earlier, so few of them have said anything at all about Egypt and its failure to take people in temporarily while Israel fights this war with Hamas. It is so striking. And I can't think of any other war in recent times where we haven't encouraged people, tragic as it is, to leave the country that is at war. You know, countries, when you're at war, there are refugees, civilians leave, especially women and children, because we want to keep them safe. And that was actively discouraged in this case by the people in...
There were people,
or blocked.
There were people who wanted to leave, who presented themselves at the border, and I think the going rate is something like $10,000. And unless you can bribe your way out of that reinforced Egyptian border fence, then you're stuck, and you are there. And they continue to be abused by Hamas. I've seen videos circulating this morning of the punishment that Hamas metes out to civilians that it accuses of being disloyal. That includes, of course, following evacuation orders or seeking to remove yourself from an area where Hamas is using civilian buildings as a stronghold. These people are tortured and executed, and that is something that the international community continues, for the most part, to remain silent on.
Yeah, you know, with the active blessing of people who claim to be pro-Palestinian, Palestinian women and children have been forced to stay in a war zone. I mean, it is just extraordinary and really exposes the cruelty of the Israelophobic mindset, which is that you're so obsessed with demonizing the Jewish state that you even lose sight of the importance of protecting civilian life when war happens. I wanted to ask you about the moral inversion in relation to all of this, which you touched on earlier. You mentioned that, you know, it was Israel that was subjected to an act of genocidal violence, and yet it's Israel that's accused of genocide. It was Israel that was invaded by an army of bigots and racists, people who are avowedly anti-Semitic, and yet it's Israel that is always accused of being a racist entity. You know, it was Israel's people on the 7th of October 2023 who were subjected to indiscriminate barbarism, and yet it's Israel that is accused of doing that. I mean, the moral inversions just stack on top of each other. And I wanted to ask you about the moment, that immediate moment after 7th of October, how you felt about the response in the West to that, in terms of the protests against Israel that took place very quickly, the way the discussion became quite anti-Israel very quickly, even though it was Israel that was attacked. Were you surprised? Were you shocked? Were you alarmed at how quickly the focus turned on Israel, even though it was Israel that had just been attacked by a genocidal army?
Well, let's not forget, we're speaking from central London, and of course on Edgware Road, people were setting off fireworks and handing out baklawa on the 7th of October. And unfortunately, we've seen similar atrocities. 9/11, of course, was being celebrated in a similar fashion in the West Bank. So that isn't surprising to anyone who has followed both national security policy, but also the public feeling in many of these places across the Middle East. And I think we need to be clear, though, about the reasons for that, which ultimately dovetail with the reasons for the perpetuation of the conflict, and that is indoctrination to terror, as well as incentivization to terror, notably through the Palestinian Authority Pay for Slay program. Perhaps we can come back to that. But it is education, Brendan, which is at the center of this. And I have to, I'm afraid, draw the parallel to education here and across across the West. That is why I was not surprised by the immediate inversion and the immediate sort of finger pointing, as you say, at Israel, despite the fact that, as it has consistently been in, Iran's decades-long proxy war against Israel, that the victim here, but of course in the kind of colonized canard and framework that is projected onto Israel, which is a further inversion, that can never be allowed to be the case. Jews are considered to be white, even though anyone who has been to Israel will know that that couldn't be further from the case. They're considered to be the colonizers as opposed to the indigenous population. Anyone who has the remotest interest in archaeology will also know that is not the case. So it is education which has been at the forefront of so much of this for so long. And I feel this is something that has been brushed under the carpet. I taught at a school in 2008, and I was part of a charity called Debate Mate. We were setting up debating societies at Teach First schools. So for the most part, these were failing inner city schools. And I taught at Bethnal Green Technology College, where in amongst the conversations about current affairs, the students were coming out with things like McDonald's pays the Jews to kill all the Arabs. And I sought to challenge and push back and encourage some critical thinking. But I did speak to my link teacher about my concerns. And she told me it was even worse than I fully appreciated. She couldn't study set texts with the children at this school in the centre of London for GCSE, which included The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, the Holocaust from a child's perspective, because, she said, they kept coming out with things like, if only Hitler were here today, he'd sort out the Jews once and for all. Now, I could tell that only a few of the school members, of the pupils, were bringing this sort of sentiment from home, but unchecked, unchallenged, the rest of the class would go back thinking this, and it was becoming a breeding ground for extremism in the centre of London. I wrote about my experiences that summer, actually. I worked at the Centre for Social Cohesion alongside Douglas Murray. And of course, nothing was done. But that school became famous some 5 years later. It had changed its name to Bethnal Green Academy, but that was the school that these 3 girls left to join ISIS. And so when I talk about education, I'm not just talking about what is the moral rot that is taking hold at universities. I'm talking about the hotbeds of extremism and radicalization that have been at play in city centre schools. And this was just one experience that I happened to have teaching on this particular programme. I'm sure, because of the complacency with which this was viewed, that this is not an isolated incident, and that shapes the public discourse when these individuals grow up and start to vote, and therefore it also shapes the political discourse. And everything we have seen, unfortunately, from the current government in terms of supporting UNRWA, refunding it, despite complicity with Hamas, despite Emily Damari telling the Prime Minister on a phone call, I was held in an UNRWA facility. We've seen an arms embargo initiated against Israel, I think on an unlawful basis because of the legal reasoning that has been made public by the government. And we have seen encouragement through the rhetoric of this government, unfortunately for the terrorists in this equation. That is part of this, whole network, if you will, of this symbiotic processes of disinformation which have been at play.
Yeah, the education contribution is incredibly concerning. And lots of teachers in France as well have raised the fact that they find it very difficult to talk about the Holocaust with their students because they know there will be pushback. Students will say it didn't happen. Why are we talking about this? I mean, it's incredibly worrying when that kind of culture takes hold in schools, which are supposed to be turning out responsible, good citizens for the future. That reminds me of something I wanted to ask you, and you've just mentioned UNRWA there. And I think the Emily Damari example is just not spoken about enough. The fact that we live under a government that reintroduced funding for UNRWA while a British citizen was being held in an UNRWA facility in Gaza. I mean, just staggering, really. But what is the role that education plays through UNRWA schools, largely, in Gaza, and then also in the West Bank as well? In fact, we shouldn't let the Palestinian Authority off the hook in relation to all of this. What role does education play in terms of, I guess, inculcating the next generation of Palestinians, innocent Palestinian kids who otherwise might get a pretty good education if it wasn't for their teachers and the school system? What role does it play in inculcating them with the kind of hatreds that then later turn into something more violent, maybe even terrorism?
The most significant role in perpetuating this conflict. This is what it all comes down to. The fact that Palestinian kids are taught from kindergarten up that the highest calling in life is to become a martyr and to kill as many Jews as possible. And the fact that this is reinforced through every facet of Palestinian society. You've got football clubs named after so-called martyrs, terrorists who have blown themselves up in discotheques or pizzerias, murdering innocents. You have arithmetic that is taught through adding up the numbers of martyrs. You have physics that is taught on the basis of how to use a slingshot. You have Palestinian Authority Kids TV, where a bumblebee explains that the trees will come to life and reveal the hiding Jews behind them and encourage the kids to pick up knives and to stab them. This is pervasive. It is child abuse, but it is also at the core of what it is that is preventing peace in the Middle East. We've seen so many initiatives, pieces of paper, handshakes in the Rose Garden of the White House. All of this, I'm afraid, is utterly meaningless, while you still have generation after generation that is having instilled in them that the essence of Palestinian nationalism is the annihilation of Israel. This is what Yasser Arafat essentially gave birth to with the Palestine Liberation Organization, the flag of the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority, which came out of it, subscribes still to this national ethos. It is what UNRWA also embodies in this so-called right of return that it advocates for. Why is the Palestinian Arab the only refugee that is recognized generation after generation? In any other context, a refugee is settled in a country and their children become recognized citizens or residents of that entity. Not here, because for the last 70 years, this idea of Palestinian refugee status has been held by Israel's surrounding Arab countries, for the most part, as the sort of axe over Israel, that once, frankly, the Jews are pushed into the sea, which is the rhetoric that we used to hear frequently on Arab media, these so-called refugees would be settled in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and that this projection of the destruction of the state of Israel still sits at the heart of so much of this education program. It is supported by the pay-for-slay policy, which I mentioned, that is paid by the Palestinian Authority, the so-called moderates in this equation, and they pay salaries, Brendan, dependent on how many Jews terrorists have been able to slaughter. The severity of the sentence marks an increase in the stipend. The organisers of the 7th of October atrocities, including Ali Kadi, the head of the Nukhba force, was in receipt of a Palestinian Authority stipend for the 2 years that he was planning the 7th of October attacks. The connection here is undeniable, and the fact that the international community continues to fund this level of indoctrination and this incentivization to terror, because it does fund the Palestinian Authority, is quite frankly disgraceful, shameful, objectionable. It ultimately means that all of these so-called allies of the State of Israel, so-called proponents of the Palestinian cause, they ultimately have blood on their hands. And it is the continuation of these misguided policies that are dragging this conflict out and that are pushing peace further away, both for Israelis and Palestinians.